Sociology 345, Video Lecture 02. Society and Culture. How do we talk about culture? Well, we have to talk about society and culture. And last time, we talked about society from a constructionist viewpoint as something that's built up out of institutions, organizations, groups, statuses and roles, etc. And we talked about and thought about different kinds of groups, different kinds of organizations, different kinds of institutions. So we have a few pictures here to remind us of those things. We've got our institution of government, the specific organization of Congress represented here. You know it's that because of the way they're dressed, and you may recognize some of them. And we've got George Washington in the background, and all of these very potent cultural symbols, like our totem, the eagle, on top of our flag. Bank of America, an organization, part of the social institution of banking in capitalist economy. Hard to imagine life without banks, even when they cause us all kinds of trouble. Still hard to imagine life without them. We talked about the family and different kinds of families, schools and the social institution of public schooling, and of course the big ones, church and state. Obviously this isn't actually the institutions of church and state. What we have here are what are instantly recognizable cultural symbols, street signs, but you get the joke, right? Church and state pointing in opposite, or maybe not opposite, but in directions that are at cross purposes with one another. Well, to these ideas, we want to add the idea of social structure. And when we say social structure, we're talking about, again, patterned interactions that are sustained over time. And in sociology, we tend to talk about class as a social structure, race and ethnicity as a social structure, gender and sexual orientation. These are the big ones. There are all sorts of other ones, but these are the ones we tend to gravitate toward. This image here is a nice representation of the social structure of class. Moving from left to right, top to bottom, you've got a guy here in a bowler in a suit representing the upper class, the owners of capital, the owners of businesses, the elite classes. In the middle, you've got the middle classes, the middlemen, the managers, the workers, fairly high level, but not usually owners. And then finally, the working class. And they're represented here in a nice way that shows us the relative prestige of each of these classes. Well, you've got a lot more people in the working class than anything else. They tend to have the least prestige, and we recognize, because of our culture, that that's represented by a lower position, lower status, lower position in the frame. So this is actually a representation of the English classes, but very similar to our own. This is a very powerful image by Robert Frank, a photographer who traveled around the country, the United States, in his car in the 1950s and 60s, associated with the Beat movement, Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, the outsider intellectuals of their time, the precursor to the hippies. And Robert Frank was an immigrant, a Swiss immigrant, and had this ability to see the United States and to see its social structures very clearly and to represent them visually in very powerful ways. This is an image from the South. It's an image of a trolley, and it's a perfect illustration of a variety of social structures in the United States at the time. You've got the very idea of structure represented by the clear rectangular shapes that structure the overall image. And then reading from left to right, as we do in this culture, you see a white male in a suit, a white female, white children, a black male, and a black female. you've got what at the time, and in many ways is still with us, a very clear structure of race and ethnicity in terms of prestige and power. On the one end, you have white males moving down to the white female, to their children, and then the black male and the black female. You've also got social class represented in the clothing. On the one hand, you've got workers' clothing, laborer and domestic servant, and the clothing of the middle and upper classes. So in a very powerful visual way, and you should take some time to look at this and look up Robert Frank if you're interested, you can see very clearly some of the social structures in the United States at the time, and like I said, in many ways, still with us. This is an illustration I grabbed out of a booklet, a little pamphlet on children's health, something that school children might see in the public schools, demonstrating some concept about exercise and healthy lifestyles. But you can see that within this image, beyond any message about health, there's a message about gender and gender relations, where you've got the male actively showing off his power, his muscles, and the female in the role of passively admiring and looking on. And this, of course, is a nice symbol of sexual orientation, maybe. Recognizable male and female symbols linked in all sorts of different kinds of ways. So, society, we've got our institutions and our organizations and our social structures and the statuses and all the roles attached to those various status positions. On the side of culture, we can talk about material culture, physical things like artifacts. Just like we looked at different kinds of families and recognized them all as family, you got a bunch of different chairs that symbolize different things. They're all just chairs. They're all just things we sit in, but they mean different things. One from the late 19th century arts and crafts movement, created in reaction to industrialization and a celebration of craftsmanship. You got a steel case chair from West Michigan, what looks like a Herman Miller or Ames chair, and of course the utilitarian folding metal chair that everybody in our culture is familiar with, has a whole set of associations with it. We can also talk about symbols. Here we've got a set of symbols, some of which I'm sure you recognize, some of which you may not recognize, but you can probably guess from the ones you do recognize that these are all symbols that have something to do with spirituality, and that would be a good guess. So that's kind of material culture on one side, and on the other side we have what we call ideal culture or non-material culture. And that's made up of a number of things: values and norms. Values are standards of judgment by which we decide on desirable goals and outcomes. Norms are the standards, the culturally defined standards of rules and conduct. Now, in the same way that people tend to mix up status and role, people tend to mix up values and norms as well. Values are abstract, and norms are concrete. Norms are about action. Values are about ideals. So, for example, you can think of something like a value we have in our culture of financial independence. But then you can also think of very different kinds of norms dictating how you go about attaining financial independence. You know, you can get it in by working hard and going to college and getting a good job and being entrepreneurial, and these are all ways of doing it that are culturally rewarded. You can also gain financial independence by dealing drugs or robbing banks or knocking people over the head and stealing their wallets. Not that I recommend you do that, but you see that both are oriented toward the same value. They're just operating differently. And in different subcultures, one might be rewarded as opposed to another. Ideology is another important idea. When our values and ideals become coherent systems of beliefs. We call them ideologies. So when people describe themselves as a liberal or a conservative or an independent, they're often describing themselves as adhering to a particular political ideology, a whole system that dictates how one thinks about certain things and the kinds of positions one would take on a variety of issues. We'll often talk about society and culture as if they are distinct from one another. And that helps us when we're analyzing things, and they are analytically distinct, but they're not really empirically distinct. They're bound up together. It's hard to talk about one without talking about the other. And so we'll hold them separate and use these terms to talk about them, but we'll recognize that in everyday life, in the real world, these things are all sort of bound up and confused together. Peter Berger, a famous sociologist, once said, "The ultimate human terror is not evil, but chaos." To illustrate terror here, I've got in the background the famous expressionist painting by Edvard Munch that many of us are familiar with, The Scream. What did Berger mean? Not evil, but chaos. Well, what he meant by that was chaos is equal to meaninglessness. When you can't make meaning, when you can't make sense out of something, you have chaos. It's all jumbled and not ordered in any meaningful way. And culture is really what wards off meaninglessness. Culture gives us meaning. Culture helps us construct meaning, and that might be a better way to think about it. It gives us an orientation. It directs our behavior and our action so that we can make the world meaningful to ourselves. Here's a nice bit of culture from Thoreau, who said, "Happiness is like a butterfly. The more you chase it, the more it will elude you. But if you turn your attention to other things, it will come and sit softly on your shoulder." Now, that's a meaningful statement. It feels right. It feels kind of poignant. It's got some beauty to it. And that's because it's a statement that comes out of an ideology that has emerged from a particular culture, and I share that culture. So it has a kind of meaning to me. And you can read something like this, a statement from an author or a poet, and kind of read backwards out of it, what's the culture that came out of? What does his statement tell you about the values of that culture, about our culture? What does it tell you about the way we think about happiness? About the way we think about human action? About our values? About our norms? I want you to think about that and keep it in mind for our next class meeting.